Have you ever wondered how the Vikings slept? Not how they fought, not how they sailed across icy seas, but how they drifted off to sleep inside their smoky wooden homes, beneath animal furs while snow pressed against the walls outside. Tonight, we're not talking about battles or kings. We're stepping quietly into the long, dark nights of the Viking Age, where families slept side by side near a glowing hearth, and dreams were seen as messages from gods and ancestors. You'll hear how their nights were divided into two halves, how their beds were made from straw and wool, and how the rhythm of sleep was shaped by the northern sun. So close your eyes. Let the sound of the fire guide you back 1,000 years. And imagine yourself in a Viking longhouse, where the air is warm, the world outside is frozen, and the night seems to last forever because the way Vikings slept was nothing like the rest of medieval Europe. If you were to step quietly into a Viking home 1,000 years ago, sometime after the sun had set over the fjord, you would not find the roaring feast halls of legend, no clinking mead cups or songs of conquest echoing through the timbers. Instead, you would step into a different world. Low light, heavy air, the smell of wood smoke, wool, and faint traces of fish. The night in a Viking longhouse was a living thing, quiet, rhythmic, and filled with the sounds of people breathing in sleep. The Vikings, like all medieval peoples, needed rest as much as they needed food or fire. But how they slept, when, where, and with whom, tells you more about their world than any saga of battle or voyage ever could. Their sleep was shaped by the land itself, a place of long winters, bright endless summers, and a constant negotiation between cold, darkness, and survival. To understand Viking sleep, you must first understand their architecture, because the structure of their homes dictated the rhythm of their nights. A Viking longhouse was both shelter and ecosystem. Built of timber and turf, sealed with clay, and thatched with straw, it was designed not for beauty, but endurance. The walls were thick enough to keep out the northern wind, and the roof beams were high in the middle, sloping down to walls of packed earth. The result was a long, narrow space divided into zones for cooking, eating, sleeping, and sometimes housing animals. At the center burned the hearth. It was not just a fireplace, but the spiritual and physical heart of the household. Around it, life happened. The hearth cooked food, gave light, provided warmth, and even dictated the sleeping arrangement. Because the Vikings' homes lacked chimneys, the smoke rose freely through a vent in the roof or drifted inside until it seeped into the walls. Over time, it coated everything in a thin layer of soot. The air would have been heavy but warm, the light dim and orange, flickering against wooden beams that held centuries of smoke. Sleeping in a longhouse was not a solitary affair. A family, their servants, guests, and sometimes livestock all shared the same interior space. On each side of the central hearth ran a raised wooden platform, often lined with straw and covered with sheepskins or woven blankets. These benches served as both seats by day and beds by night. The older family members, or the most important guests, slept closest to the fire, while younger or lower status people took their places near the walls. Where it was colder, privacy did not exist in this world. There were no walls to separate individuals, no doors to close, no silent rooms. To sleep in a Viking household was to become part of a single breathing organism, a community joined by necessity. Every creak of the beams, every rustle of straw, every sigh was shared. The Vikings' approach to sleep was deeply practical. The harsh climate forced them to treat rest as a form of work, something done to recover strength for the next day, rather than a personal retreat. Nights were long, and firewood was precious. Every spark from the hearth mattered. To keep the fire alive through the night, someone would rise midway to stir the coals, add a few pieces of wood, and check on the animals. Sleep was rarely unbroken. In fact, what modern historians call segmented sleep, the practice of sleeping in two distinct periods during the night, was likely common across the Norse world. The idea was simple. People would fall asleep soon after dusk, sleep for several hours, then wake in the middle of the night for a period of quiet activity, perhaps an hour or two, before returning to bed until dawn. We know from later medieval records in England and France that this pattern, known as first sleep and second sleep, was widespread across Europe before the Industrial Age. There's no reason to think the Vikings were different. In the middle of a long, dark Scandinavian winter with nearly 18 hours of night, it made sense to divide rest into parts. During this waking interval, sometimes called the watch, people might talk softly, tend the fire, pray to their gods, check on the livestock, or even engage in quiet household work like sewing or sharpening tools. For many, it was also a time of reflection. Dreams were important in Norse culture. The sagas are filled with stories of dreams foretelling danger, journeys, or the will of the gods. The middle of the night, between the first and second sleeps, was thought to be a liminal time, a bridge between the human and spiritual worlds. The air was quiet, the hearth low, and the boundary between waking and dreaming thin. Imagine lying on a wooden platform near the center of a longhouse, wrapped in furs, with your family sleeping around you. The air is warm from the fire, but heavy with smoke. Outside, the world is frozen and silent. Snow pressing against the turf walls, wind howling faintly in the distance. You open your eyes in the darkness. The fire has burned low, its light just barely tracing the outline of a clay pot or the curve of a sleeping animal. You hear a quiet cough from the other side of the room, then the soft shifting of someone turning in their sleep. You might rise, add a log to the fire, and sit for a while. Staring at the embers, in this stillness, you might remember a dream. Maybe you tell it to your spouse beside you, or whisper it to a family member who's also awake. The Norse believed dreams were meaningful, a message, an omen, or even a glimpse of the world of spirits. Some dreams were warnings, others promises. A dream of water might signal a coming voyage. A dream of wolves, a sign of conflict. When dawn approached, people would settle back down for their second sleep. By the time the faint gray light of morning seeped through the smoke hole, the household would begin to stir once again. The pattern of Viking sleep, shaped by light and season, reflected the rhythms of their world. Unlike much of medieval Europe farther south, where artificial lighting and urban life began to alter sleep habits earlier, the rural Norse were governed by the slow cycles of nature. Their days were ruled by the sun, their nights by the fire. In summer, when the northern sun barely dipped below the horizon, sleep became shorter and lighter. There was too much to do: fishing, farming, repairing boats, gathering supplies before the next long winter. Many chroniclers describe people sleeping only a few hours each night during the warm season, rising with the dawn to work through the long day. In winter, the opposite was true. Darkness reigned, and rest came often, not as leisure, but as a rhythm of survival. It was a time of mending nets, carving wood, and tending to livestock. The long nights encouraged introspection and storytelling. Around the hearth, families shared tales of ancestors and gods, creating a kind of collective memory that sustained. Then through isolation, the longhouse itself was a world of sound at night. The fire crackled and hissed. Animals shifted in their stalls. Sheep bleated softly. The occasional clatter of hooves broke the silence, and the rhythmic breathing of the family filled the air. The smell was a mixture of wood smoke, wool, dried fish, and damp earth. It might not seem peaceful by modern standards, but to the Norse, it was home, a place where warmth, food, and companionship met in the dark. In wealthier households, sleeping arrangements could be slightly more elaborate. Archaeological remains from high-status Norse sites such as Borg in Lofoten or Laer in Denmark show evidence of carved bed frames and decorated sleeping platforms. Some were enclosed, built with short walls or curtains for warmth and privacy. These were the predecessors of the medieval box bed, later common in Northern Europe. But even in such homes, the sense of shared space persisted. The chief and his wife might sleep in a slightly separated area, but their servants, warriors, and family members would still rest nearby. Beds were simple but functional. Wooden frames filled with straw or dried reeds, topped with blankets of wool or animal hides. Linen sheets were rare luxuries reserved for the wealthy. Most people slept directly under layers of woven wool and fur, sometimes using their everyday cloaks as blankets. Pillows might be stuffed with feathers, moss, or even hay. The materials themselves tell you about the Viking relationship with the land. Every piece of bedding, every hide, every tuft of wool came from the animals they raised. Comfort was not purchased. It was made. One fascinating detail that survives from sagas and archaeological evidence is the use of sleeping order. In some households, the sleeping spots were arranged by age, status, or duty. The head of the household slept closest to the fire, symbolizing protection and leadership. Children and servants took the outer benches. Travelers or guests were offered places near the hearth as a gesture of hospitality, a sacred duty in Norse culture. To offer warmth and safety to a stranger was a moral act, one the gods themselves were said to reward. Thus, sleep in the Viking Age was not only about rest, but about relationships, a visible map of hierarchy and kinship. When Vikings went to sea, their sleeping habits changed dramatically. Life aboard a longship left little room for comfort. Crews slept under open skies or beneath simple awnings, wrapped in furs to guard against the cold spray of the sea. There were no cabins or bunks, only space between oars or beside cargo. Sailors might sleep in shifts, one group rowing while another rested. Sleep became a precious commodity, stolen whenever the wind and waves allowed. On land or sea, however, the Viking approach remained pragmatic. They did not separate night from day as we do now. Instead, life flowed continuously. Sleep was an interval, a pause between labors, taken as needed and adapted to circumstance, compared to the rest of medieval Europe, where monasteries and cities began regulating sleep with bells and curfews. The Vikings lived by older rhythms, those of season and necessity. Their world lacked the artificial boundaries of modern time. There were no hours struck by church bells, no candles marking the passage of night. Only fire, sun, and dark. What also made Viking sleep different was the meaning they attached to it. In Norse mythology, sleep and death were intertwined. The goddess Hel ruled over the realm of the dead, a place described as shadowed and silent, not unlike the winter nights of the north. To sleep was to visit a place near that threshold. The Old Norse word drömur, dreams, shared roots with concepts of wandering or traveling, as if the sleeper's spirit left the body to move between worlds. Because of this, dreams carried both fascination and fear. A restless night could be interpreted as a warning from the gods or the ancestors. Conversely, a peaceful dream might signal protection. Some people even placed protective charms or carved runes near their sleeping places to ward off bad dreams or spirits. The Christianization of Scandinavia in the 10th and 11th centuries slowly changed these ideas. As churches rose and priests preached new doctrines, the pagan meanings of sleep, its connection to spirits and omens, began to fade. But even then, old customs lingered. People continued to sleep close together for warmth, to honor their hearths, and to treat the night as a shared journey rather than an individual escape. If you compare a Viking longhouse to a medieval European manor of the same period, the difference is striking. In southern Europe, wealthy nobles slept in curtained beds, often in separate chambers. Candles burned late into the night. Servants stood watch. The bedroom became a place of status and privacy, a luxury unknown to the Norse farmer. The Vikings' world remained communal and pragmatic long after others turned towards solitude and ceremony. That practicality, born of survival, defined their relationship with sleep. Even their bedtime clothing reflected it. There were no silk nightgowns or linen shifts. Most people simply slept in what they wore during the day: wool tunics, trousers, or dresses, adding extra layers of fur when needed. In summer, they might shed these for comfort, but in winter, every bit of warmth was precious. And yet, within this simplicity was a kind of comfort. The communal warmth, the familiarity of shared breathing, the soft crackle of the hearth. These created a sense of safety no isolated chamber could provide. It was a world where people lived and slept within earshot of those they loved, where the firelight touched every face. And the line between waking and dreaming belonged to everyone. Over time, as Norway, Denmark, and Iceland moved deeper into the medieval world, daily life began to change. Trade with Europe brought new materials, linen, imported oil lamps, iron bed fittings, and new ideas about domestic life. The great longhouses slowly gave way to smaller, more specialized buildings with separate rooms. Privacy crept into the architecture. But for centuries, the old rhythm endured in rural communities, where the night was still long and firelight remained the only clock. To modern eyes, Viking sleep might seem crude or uncomfortable. But if you listen closely, it contains lessons our world has forgotten. The Norse treated rest not as indulgence, but as necessity, a humble, shared act of survival. They slept not to escape life, but to sustain it. When you imagine them, a family gathered in a longhouse, a sailor dozing under a fir on a rocking ship, a mother wrapping her child beside the hearth, you begin to see how sleep connected their entire existence. It was a thread woven through labor, faith, and kinship. Their nights were long, but they were not lonely, perhaps in a way. The Vikings knew something we have lost, that true rest does not come from silence or solitude, but from warmth, rhythm, and belonging. And as the wind howled across the northern plains, and the snow piled against the door, the soft, steady breathing inside the longhouse became the quiet heartbeat of a civilization, the sound of people who had learned to rest within the vast, cold world they called home. If you're still here, that means you made it through another quiet journey through time. Thank you for spending your night with me. I hope this story helped you drift a little closer to sleep, or at least help the world feel a bit softer for a while. If you enjoyed this calm corner of history, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe to Quiet Boring Sleep for more slow, peaceful stories from the past every week. We explore the gentle side of history, the forgotten routines, quiet lives, and all the little things that shaped the world while everyone else was asleep. So until next time, close your eyes, breathe deeply, and let the echoes of the past fade softly into dreams. Good night from Quiet Boring Sleep.